Welcome. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Danielle Barnes, and I'm the CEO of Women Talk Design. And I welcome you to our Speaker Stories event today with Eriol Fox. I'd love to hear from you in the chat. I know we have folks joining from all around the world. Is this your first time at a Speaker Stories event? So we'd love to hear if you've been to one of these before, if this is your first time. You can write a quick note in the chat. First time, fantastic. Great. Couple first timers. This is still a pretty new series for us. So at Women Talk Design, our larger mission is to help get a more diverse group of speakers on stage. And we do a lot of different initiatives surrounding that. So we have a speaker directory featuring women and non-binary folks from around the world. We also work with event organizers on how they can design more inclusive events that our speakers want to be a part of. And then finally, we host different events and trainings, now all virtually, to really inspire folks to start speaking, help equip them with the tools and the confidence to speak up, and then give them opportunities to practice. And so this series is one that we started once everything moved online for us. And we wanted to have an opportunity to feature some of the speakers on our platform, and also give y'all the opportunity to ask questions and hear more about their stories, how they got to where they are, and ask your own questions about their experience. And so one of the things that's been really nice too, I think Eriol is our first speaker joining from Europe. And so we're bringing in speakers to outside. I'm based in the US, outside of just the US, and it will have folks, more folks in Europe. We have someone joining us from Singapore in a couple of weeks. And so it's nice to be able to have some new faces that maybe you wouldn't have been able to join, if we did something that was on Pacific time or whatever that is. So welcome, and really glad to have you here. Before I introduce Eriol, the format of today's session, I wanted to go over a bit. So first, I'm going to start off. I have some pre-prepared questions to ask Eriol, just about their journey to speaking and their experiences. But really, I want to make sure that you have time to ask your questions. So if you want to start thinking now, what questions do you have for Eriol? I'm going to have you about halfway through drop those in the chat. And then if you feel like unmuting and asking that question live, you can. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat and I will read it to them so that you can really get your questions answered. And then the last 15 minutes, I invite you to stick around if you can. And that's when we do breakouts. And the goal is that when you're coming here, you're both hearing from our speaker, but you also have an opportunity to meet other folks in the community. So I have a couple of prompts that you can use to chat about just where you are in your speaker journey, what you heard today that really resonated, and then we'll bring it back together and close up. So that's kind of our run of show for today. And again, if you just joined us, we do have live captioning. I'm dropping that again in the chat, and start to think of your questions. And I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Eriol Fox. So Eriol Fox has been working as a designer for 10 years, and most recently in the humanitarian, free and open software and human rights technology space, helping create products for complex problems like crisis response, gender violence, peace building, genocide prevention, democracy, and activism. They take their work through humanitarian.design to pay the bills, and while looking for a permanent full-time home. And as an advocate for designing, existing, thriving, and participating in the open source software and humanitarian space, they worked on a project to make an impact in the design community called Open Design that I recommend y'all check out. Beside their master's degree, they investigated the user experience journey of people with terminal illnesses and people that care for them, and is now a PhD candidate investigating designers participating in humanitarian topics globally through open source software. Eriol is a non-binary, gender-fluid queer person who uses they/them pronouns, who in their talks often covers LGBTQ+ representation in visual design. They also cover some representations of race, ethnicity, and visible and non-visible disabilities from the perspective of a white person with an invisible disability. Eriol has spoken at events all over, from UX Bristol and RightsCon to IXDA in Berlin, Ladies That UX in Bristol and Tokyo, the Non-Binary and Tech Conference, and so much more. And we are so excited to have them here. So please help me welcome Eriol.
Hello. Thanks for the intro. I mean, actually, there's a slight update. It always changes, right? Your bio is one of the hardest things to maintain because often we change a lot of things uh, through our design journeys. And actually, I've recently found a permanent home at the Open Food Network, which is pretty
Awesome.
cool. Working on cool stuff. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look at that. I love that. Maybe we can talk more about that in a bit.
Mm.
So I'd love to hear, I want to hear about your journey into speaking. I know that you've done a lot of speaking. And I think it would be great to hear about, where you are right now. So what is it? Are there
Mm.
certain topics that you're really excited about and that you're speaking about currently? And then we can take a step back in time.
Yeah. So the topics that I'm speaking about currently, there are three main ones. The first is a talk which is really focusing on two different projects I did at my last organization, which was the human rights data collection open source tool called Ushahidi. And that talk is about UX research, so user experience research and ethnographic kind of approaches to working on those kinds of projects like human rights related projects. So it takes a deep dive into some of the complexities about being a designer in these spaces, these really intense spaces sometimes and intense topics. The second is about open source design. It is something that I fell very deeply in love with very, very quickly, is the kind of community of open source and what it can actually do and what it means for designers. It's a very interesting, very reasonably new space for designers moving into. And it's kind of one of the ones that is very exciting because, when you're right at the beginning of like something big, it's got that quality to it. So I love talking about the design experience in open source. And the last one is I still do talk a lot about diversity and inclusion topics. It was how I got into speaking, actually, really. But I really wanted to focus on what it means to us as designers, diversity and inclusion, and what kind of day-to-day things does wanting to be more inclusive, more diverse, and include better representation mean for us day to day as designers wanting to be inclusive. Um, those are the three things that I talk about, but I can often be found going into topics about trauma and design. That's probably one of the things that I'll be thinking about a little bit more in depth. So how, as designers, when we work on, again, any kind of topic, it doesn't have to be human rights related or kind of humanitarian. There's a lot of work that a lot of designers do in lots of organizations which can touch on some really, really complex topics. And, it's a really interesting space right now.
That's
Yeah,
great.
so
Yeah.
that's what I'm into, right? Yeah, yeah.
Lots of different topics. Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear more about, you mentioned in the diversity and inclusion is how you got your start in speaking. And can you tell us a bit more about that? How you even got started to wanting to speak and then how you got those first couple of speaking engagements.
Mm. So I think I was trying to think about this, like when was the first moment where I was like, yes, I'm going to do speaking? And I kind of feel like there was definitely a moment where it became less of a scary prospect for me as a professional. But I do think that it wouldn't be right of me to sort of say that I don't have a background to some extent in being on stage in a sense. Like I did an art degree, and quite a lot of that art degree was performance related. So really, I mean, to be fair, I don't talk about this part of my life very often, the kind of artist side of things, because I transitioned into design. But really, I mean, when you are able to go out into the street and do some performance art, really getting up on stage and talking about the professional work that you do does often become a lot less scary. Well, it's kind of a different kind of scary, but yeah, so I do have a sort of background in being in front of people and doing what I do in a sense. So university did prepare me for that in some ways. But I think I was, in my career, maybe about 6 or 7 years into my career. So I'd been doing things for a little while. And I was becoming more and more interested and more involved in how the diversity issues. So not just from a kind of hiring and how we're being treated as basically non-men or non kind of male presenting people. And I really started to think about how I was doing that as a practitioner. So I started kind of making notes for myself and trying to put things into practice. And I did a couple of speaking things at my university as a graduate, talking about actually my kind of career path before I actually did my first tech conference, as it were. So I was able to talk about my design journey a little bit towards graduates or students at my old university. That was kind of a comfortable first couple of speaking gigs. But I think my the big conference that I did, where it kind of solidified why I wanted to continue, refining my conference speaking, refining the topics that I wanted to talk about, was the first non-binary in tech conference. And this is a conference that was run and started by a now friend, which is great, called Aurora, and she, or they use both she and they pronouns, really wanted to give a platform to all the different people that identify as non-binary or gender fluid, or kind of outside of the two sort of typical options, space to talk about what they're doing from any kind of perspective, tech and design, or any kind of topics. And yeah, it was a fantastic event, and it really was one of the first times where I was like, I got amazing feedback. I was super nervous. I think I practiced that talk. I can't even remember how many times I practiced it. It was well over 10 times. I practiced it to a live local meetup as well, because I was like, I need to make sure that this is delivering what it needs to deliver at the time. And it was really the moment where I felt like, okay, I kind of know how to do this now, and it was well received, and I kind of got hooked from then onwards, really. And then it just kind of ended up being kind of like, I've got a talk in the sort of bag, as it were, and I was kind of like, I really want to continue talking about this, and then just applying to different conferences. At that early stage, it was very much still me putting in pitches and putting in proposals and approaching conferences and meetups with the content that I wanted. It really wasn't until very recently that I started sort of getting people, I don't know whether there's a term for this, maybe maybe you all know, but like when people seek you out and try and want to like book you as a speaker. So really that hasn't sort of started happening until the last like two or so years. But I still pitch as well. I still think it's really important to kind of balance the two, or go for the one that you find most comfortable. So if you just want to be booked, or if you just want to pitch, there's no right or wrong way to do it, essentially. So yeah, that's what did I miss it? Was that?
Yeah, that was great. That was great.
Okay,
that was really helpful to hear that. I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. And so, how do you decide what are the places that you want to speak at? So obviously you were seeking out specific opportunities, and so, and I'm curious if that's evolved at all now that you're speaking more. What you think about when you are asked to speak. Do you say yes to everything? What do you evaluate? And then as you're looking for speaking opportunities, what avenues are you looking at?
That's one of these questions which is going to get into kind of my personality type, which I'm totally happy to go into. So until very recently, I was saying yes to everything, because I'm still very much in this mindset, and I don't know whether I'll ever completely not be in the mindset of, I feel very grateful when people want to have me speak, like when I pitch and they say, this sounds fantastic and we'd really love you to come and talk about this, or when they reach out to me and say, we've seen this, or we've heard about this, and would you do this? It's still something that I still think, really? Wow, cool. Yeah, I'm totally happy to do that. I've had a lot of lovely things happen where people have like given me both like just great compliments, but also lots of constructive feedback as well. Like I have, and also some instances of not constructive feedback after talks as well. So I've definitely had like the full spectrum of kind of people saying stuff about the things that I've said essentially on stage. But I think I've gone off on a tangent slightly. But yeah, no, so I now am a little bit more considerate about where I want to do speaking, and also the kinds of conferences that I would want to speak at. So learning from a lot of really amazing peers, mostly from Twitter, like Jessica Rose is one of the people that I look to a lot, and Tatiana Mack as well. Some of the stuff that Tatiana Mack has written about what she will and will not accept as far as like a speaking gig goes is super important. So I have started to think about whether going and speaking at a particular conference on a particular topic, what it's going to do for me as a speaker, and whether also this kind of harder topic of what does that community want or need. Like this is a harder one to try and find out, because I tend to trust the conference organizers when they want something and accept something. It's because my understanding is that they know that the community or the attendees will find value in that topic and that talk. But sometimes it's good to check, because I think another tricky thing about this space is that when you're not historically not well represented on stage, sometimes there is the worry that, you know, you have a good talk and you have great content, but maybe you are being booked for diversity and inclusion reasons. There definitely has been those things that have passed my mind at some conferences, especially when they want, when people have asked me for the diversity and inclusion talk. I sometimes, particularly for that one, I will interrogate, so why, you know, who else have you got speaking on diversity and inclusion? Is it just me? Is it just kind of, are you filling your quota? And yeah, I think there was a time where I didn't and wasn't as informed about choosing a conference that is making a real effort towards better representation. So I now will absolutely not speak on all male panels, and if somebody like be the only not man on a panel. And also I want to always make sure that people have got access to people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, and also people within the impairments and disabled community as well. So I like to try and make sure that the conferences have done as much as they possibly can to do that, and also provide them with access to people that I know of that they can reach out to make that more inclusive, and kind of defer opportunities. I'm now in the wonderful privileged space where I can say, oh, thank you for, you know, accept either, well, it's usually when people reach out to me now, not necessarily when I pitch, but when people do reach out to me, I will often now say, have you considered this person who speaks on the same topic, but maybe not as kind of well known? Not that I'm particularly well known, but that also needs more stage time. So that is definitely a really privileged space to be in, to be able to do that. And it's still something that sometimes conference organizers feel a certain type of way about. So without really saying much more, but yeah.
That's all great. And I'm wondering if there's a way to spot that early, like before you get far down the road. Have you picked up any techniques, or like, is there any like quick scans that you do to try to spot that early before you're too deep into the conversation with them?
It's kind of difficult. So I guess whispery networks, or like networks like Women Talk Design are good places, and the ADA list as well, to kind of scope out, hey, how are you treated at this conference? There's a lot of that going on in lots of different communities, like the non-binary community, the queer community. I'm sure that other communities that I don't represent as have a similar sort of network of testing things out, and seeing whether certain organizers that maybe organize multiple different events are also present, and maybe they have like different, they have this similar way of organizing events that you maybe want to stay clear of. But also early warning signs. Typically I will be, you know, this is kind of a tricky thing to say, but typically I will be more wary of a conference which the person that has reached out to me is identifies as a man. I will want to know who on the conference organizing committee is not a man, and in what capacity are they part of the decision conference conference organization process. So it's always a good sign, at least like a bare minimum, is that the conference has people diverse of all different kinds of marginalized groups within the organizing committee. And then another thing that I personally look for, which is definitely a personal thing, it's who's sponsoring the event as well. I look at sponsors now, and I look at whether it's, you know, not necessarily sponsors that, you know, are big corporations, because sometimes that's fine. But I also, usually if you look at the sponsors, you can pretty much find out that potentially this conference has been able to get a certain amount of, like, say, funding, and what are they spending that funding towards? Are they spending it towards, you know, better access for attendees? Are they spending it towards paying their speakers? And that's usually a good indication that, as well as if they're not willing to have that conversation with you, or they haven't made that public, it's like a really great thumbs up bonus sign for me that if a conference or an event has made a lot of their inner workings public, like, this is how we make decisions, these are the reasons why we might not, you know, accept these kinds of things, and this is where we spend our money. So those are typically the kinds of things that I look out for. But I think it's actually really, really tricky to find early warning signs. I tend to need to have a conversation with somebody who has spoken at that conference before, or a conference organizer now. Yeah. I'm less afraid of approaching people that, you know, say, I run X conference, and they kind of got a bit of a sort of swag about it. And I will kind of, I have been known, especially in the local scene here in Bristol in the UK, to have some arguments, just straight up arguments with some conference organizers around tech about how they're doing things and how it's just not acceptable, and they could be doing it a lot differently, and it's not that difficult, and here's where to find how to get access to people that you claim that you're looking for, but, you know.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great to share, and for people to think about too, is like, how can I approach the situation? So thank you. I want everyone else who's here to start thinking about what questions you have for Eriol. We want to make sure you can get yours answered. So I'm going to ask this next question, and I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. I'd love to hear, what advice have you either learned along the way or picked up along the way when it comes to speaking in general that you found to be really valuable, that you'd want to share with folks that are either just getting started, or maybe have been speaking for a bit but are, you know, looking for advice from people who've been in this for a while?
Yeah, this is so advice that I've heard. I think there's lots of different kinds of advice that I've had over my speaking life. I kind of don't really want to call it a career. I don't intend to make it something which contributes, like, to my income. I know some people do, which is totally valid and totally cool. But I The reasons that I speak is more because I sometimes have certain things that I've learned or certain things that I've done that I literally cannot stay quiet about. And people have told me, yeah, that's really interesting and I'd want to learn more about that. And that's typically why I choose the things that I choose to speak about. But advice. So I think there was one piece of bad advice that I got. And again, personal opinion about this as bad advice. But with your question about choosing where to speak, and like who you want to speak to audiences wise, I once had a piece of advice from somebody that does a lot of public speaking to consider choosing where to speak based off of a location that you want to visit. And I think that the reason that I think it's bad advice for me was that that wasn't like my driving reason for doing speaking. It was about what communities am I gonna be able to get involved with, and not necessarily about being able to. The particular conference we were talking about was JavaScript JS Hawaii, and I was like, yeah, of course, you know, I'd love to visit Hawaii someday, but I'm not going to pitch a talk to JS Hawaii that, you know, is just because I want to go to Hawaii. I would want to have something that is really responsive to that community that is wanted. But sometimes there is like some places that I've been able to visit because of conference speaking, and it's not so much the places, like the physical locations, though that is great, but it's more the communities that I get to meet. So like the open source community Africa people, you know, I honestly could not wait to spend more time with them, essentially, and have more conversations with the wider community. And that was, you know, the fact that I got to visit Lagos is fantastic, but I was more like, please let me have, you know, eat jollof with you, and also get to eat like jollof from Nigeria as well, which is awesome. Food, one of the best things about traveling around different conferences is the food as well. But so I think it's not, so think about what your reasons for speaking are. I think that's good advice, whether it's about sharing something with a particular community, experiencing a particular community, learning from another community. So one good reason for pitching at certain events might be that actually, you know, you're pitching a talk which is sort of in the periphery of what a conference is doing, but actually you're going to learn so much from that conference. Like, so one of the reasons that I might, for example, pitch to JS Hawaii at some point is because actually I'm moving more into those kinds of programming languages, and I really want to learn from the community there, as well as maybe hopefully offer some of my insight as well. So those are good reasons. Think about the reasons why you want to continue talking. Another kind of controversial piece of advice maybe, I got this from another speaker as well that's been doing it for, I honestly can't remember how many years, but I think practicing is really, really useful. And preparing is really, really great, but there is definitely, you definitely have to think about your own style of preparation and practice. So I really can get, what's the word, like in my head, and I can over polish something. And sometimes you just need to do it once and then know what works. So being able to actually practice to a small community is really, really helpful, because then you can figure out what parts of the material are easily understood by what audiences where, and also what you need to expand on, what you need to practice more, how you want to communicate something. So I think that I have definitely changed from a person that will do months and months and months of preparation to somebody that might do days or weeks of preparation. And, you know, it's not a bad thing to be prepping, you know, and finalizing your talk, you know, on the plane. I have done this, finalizing your talk on the plane to the place where you're going to do it. And also bothering the person in the seat next to you to look over your slides maybe. Only once I've done that, promise. but yeah, you know, think about what your preparation style, if it gives you more peace of mind to do lots and lots of preparation, then great, but it doesn't have to be that way. And also listen to the conference about what they want. There's another piece of advice, actually. I have been on the speaker side, but also on the organizer side, is I think it's always a good piece of advice to be as responsive as you possibly can to conference organization communications. And I do think that there are some conferences that over communicate. I have definitely spoken at one conference where I was like, oh, not another email, not another document to read about how to do this. It was like, you know, it felt like a lot of extra time that they were asking from me as well as I talk. But when it's always good to be very as prompt as you can possibly be to what your conference or what your venue, wherever you're doing your speaking, needs from you. But it's also fine to be flexible within that. I've definitely very rarely had a conference not be able to be flexible, like, you know, oh, the deadline for putting slides in has passed. Oh, can I have a little bit of an extension? Yeah, of course. Yeah, they just kind of want to know where you're at mostly. So yeah, there's some sort of random haphazard pieces of advice.
It's great. No, lots of good advice is, you know, don't get too caught up on the location, which right now, you know, most events are online. So if that's, you know, what you're doing it for, that might be a little bit harder. Finding your own practice style and communicating with event organizers. I think that's all really great. Thanks, Eriol. I want to open it up to folks who've joined in. You joined for a reason, and we want to make sure that you can get your questions answered. So I definitely have more that I want to ask Eriol as well, but I know that the best questions always come from you. So feel free to unmute and ask. You can put it in the chat, but I want to give you all that time.
Hi, Eriol. My name is Tanya Schlauder. I've seen your posts and on the Simply Secure Slack and enjoyed your posts there. So I saw you were speaking and I wanted to say hello. And but I also work in open source, and so I find it, and I'm the only female on my team, all male team. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see open source as a little bit, like how you approach it, if you approach it differently.
Yeah, sure. So for folks that don't know, the Simply Secure Slack is amazing. Simply Secure is an organization that is kind of globally based, but they maintain a Slack community, and it's where the human rights centered design group organizes. So, and that is a completely open community group. Anyone that's interested in the intersection of design and human rights can join and come to our community calls. And Simply Secure, such a fantastic organization. So really big fan. Yeah, so open source is a kind of a tricky one, but also quite specific. And there's definitely other folks that have been doing talks at open source organizations, at open source conferences for longer than I have. Definitely the people over at Open Source Design, so opensourcedesign.net, they are a community open source designers or designers working on open source projects or in open source orgs that have been doing it. I think it got founded about 5 years ago. Quite a few of them, you know, are a bit burnt out now, so they tend to, you know, step back from a lot of the organization. But I think how I approach open source, I think that design in open source is still so new, it's still so unknown for the wider open source software technology space, that I find one of the biggest frustrations is I want to start having more deeper and involved conversations about some of the things that I'm experiencing as a designer, and start trying to have those kinds of nuanced conversations. But a lot of the open source conferences, like maybe FOSDEM is one of the biggest ones, or, you know, All Things Open is actually Another one, there's many different open source conferences, from very, very large to reasonably small. And I kind of, I think the biggest hurdle that I have is that, as well as being a unrepresented gender, I'm an underrepresented function. And still there's a lot of people within the open source community that sort of look at designers coming and doing talks and kind of frown and say, why are you here? Oh, and then they get it. But still the questions of like, why are you here, are still really hard to hear. And it's kind of like, I'm getting to the point now, 2 years into open source related stuff. I know lots of people have been around a lot longer, but I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm probably going to be tired of explaining why I'm present, and start wanting to have bigger conversations about how we can start to really make improvements in the space for designers, and why that's important, and why that's really, really cool and exciting. So yeah, the talks that they tend to, the open source conferences tend to be keen on are the more sort of 101 beginner level, I suppose. Not that those talks are bad talks, but the kind of deeper stuff is a little bit harder, or you need to really focus on the open source technology. So an example, sorry. To go into an example, I went to Phosphor-G, which is free and open source software in the GIS, so mapping space. So geospatial, I think GIS stands for something, geospatial, basically maps. And I did a talk on open source design, like a kind of 101. And most people, in fact, most not male presenting people, not to, you know, drag men too much, you know, we're all the non-male presenting people were super like, oh, you're here and we'd love to talk more about how design can be involved in free and open source, but also the mapping space. But I definitely had some super hostile conversations, like just like scrutinizing my knowledge of what the definition of free and open source is and all this kind of stuff about, you know, open source versus free and open source, which technically is different, and then the free as in free beer thing. And I'm like, I don't drink beer. Can we think of a different way of describing free? And so this is getting a little bit granular about open source related stuff, but yeah, I think that to widen out the lens of from open source specifically, I think that as design grows as a needed function across technology, there's always going to be spaces where we are, as designers, kind of looked at as like, why are you here, and suspicious. Like, I think other examples would be like the data space, and maybe machine learning spaces, and maybe even AI and blockchain sort of spaces, so cryptocurrencies. So there are spaces where we're kind of not necessarily it's not that we're not welcome, it's just that people, the other people that kind of are there, and I don't want to categorize them as like the people that code or, you know, particular kinds of people, but they just will kind of look at you like and want to know why you're there, and that can get super exhausting.
I love your observation about the level of conversation regarding design that's happening. It needs to go deeper, definitely. I hadn't quite put my finger on it that way. I've just kind of been wondering, well, why isn't this interesting to me?
Yeah, there's only so many conversations I can have about with open source maintainers or open source projects. So just update your README. Just put the word designer in your README. There's only like, it will start getting to this point where I'm like, why haven't you done this yet? Rather than, maybe you could include in your README something about designers. You know, so yeah, it goes beyond that. I feel your pain.
Yep. Eriol, in the chat, we have a question from Chloe about what advice you have for speaking or working in open source design that's specific for contractors, because it can feel some of these spaces are more difficult to enter if you're an independent designer. So if you have any advice there.
Yeah, sure. So I am kind of one of those people. I've done some freelance stuff and more recently doing freelance and contract work, but I've always been in-house. I'm kind of one of these designers that feels most comfortable in that environment, essentially. So maybe not so, maybe my advice isn't um so as good as somebody that's been contracting for a really long time. But you're right, particularly with, I would say, the humanitarian space, and yes, the open source space as well. And if we're talking about contracting for or speaking at open source organizations, there kind of will maybe be this again, this extra level of confusion if people are reading like your talk title and then the organization that you work for, which is like maybe independent on your own organization, and they don't kind of you're not affiliated with a big open source or well-known-ish open source organization, or it doesn't have open in the title or open source in the title of your org, or the same with humanitarian rights. So if you're kind of a designer that does lots of contract work for different human rights organizations, which is totally valid, but maybe if you're not, I think this is the same problem or similar problem. I sometimes have these spicy conversations with people about why so many people that are at the big tech companies, the three big or the many big tech companies, just always seem to be speaking at conferences. I had this conversation with Eriol quite a lot about like, you know, there's another Facebook speaker, there's another Google speaker. It's like, not to drag the big companies too hard, but I think, yeah, so advice for moving into the space, I would say, you know, it's just probably going to take a bit longer and be a little bit more of a perseverance approach. I would actually, for open source, I would say that you might have better results from the attendees and the organizers if you work on less talks and more like workshops or active sessions, because I think that there is a certain credibility that when you're giving a talk about open source and design, or humanitarian and design, and you're attached to and affiliated to an organization, they will just listen to your talk. But I think that when you're a contractor or you're a less well-known organization, if you're doing something and offering them like some kind of workshop activity where they actually actively get to put into practice what you're saying, I've seen this have better results when you're in this case. So maybe consider, when you're pitching or when you're talking to these spaces, something that very, very explicitly and clearly demonstrates your value and what you're telling, or helping them to learn, because then it will be, I think you'll have a better and easier time of it. I've definitely seen talks do this, like do a very active session with some kind of like a hard related activity, or working on like a online wise, working with like a Miro board and things like that. Humanitarian is a slightly different, being that, I kind of hate to say this, but the humanitarian or sort of space is very, what's the word, like insular. It's very cliquey to some extent, not because they want to be, but because I think, you know, the humanitarian organizations are hugely underfunded and under-resourced, and a lot of the time they cannot just absolutely, the people working there don't have this time and space to expand their network of people coming to do stuff. But the best thing that I think you can do to enter that space is to, if you have the time, to start engaging with some of the communities that already exist. So like the Human Rights Centered Designers community is a really, really good one from the Simply Secure Slack. And going to and pitching at conferences like the Internet Freedom Festival and RightsCon. They are very, very the more inclusive events where they value outside, as it were, people coming in and doing sessions. They understand that there's value there more so than maybe some of the than some of the other kind of humanitarian conferences. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Eriol. I have one last question I want to ask. I wonder if you can answer it quickly, because I want to make sure we can do a couple minutes of breakouts, but I think it's relevant and important, about handling criticism. I know that you spoke about how you've had both constructive criticism, but also maybe it's just some like unnecessary, rude criticism. And that's something I speak with a lot with people who are hesitant to start speaking, is how will I handle, especially people that are calling me out or being rude or, you know, yelling at me on the internet. And so I'm wondering if you have any, I know it's a big question, but any quick advice you can share on that topic.
Okay. Another thing you can check at a conference is whether they have a code of conduct, and if they don't engage. So that's a good thing to double check. I've definitely had to refer back to code of conducts when somebody has individually like DM'd me with something inappropriate. I think the best piece of short advice that I can give, other than code of conducts, is no matter whether a talk goes well or medium or bad, however you kind of want to categorize how well your talk has gone, I always need anything between 6 hours or 24 hours of like recovery time. Sometimes I will need like to literally lock myself away after a speaking engagement and do whatever I need to do for me to kind of process that experience. So I think that that's probably the best thing I can say.
Great. Eriol, thank you so much. You shared so much great advice, and I really appreciated hearing your story. So I just want to give you a quick round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much. As I shared, for everyone here, thank you for being here and participating, and we hope you'll stick around for the next couple minutes. Part of these events, I think it's really great to be able to meet other folks and talk about what you heard and what you learned. And so I'm going to drop a couple questions in the chat, and then I'm going to invite you to join us in breakout rooms. These are going to be small rooms of just a couple people where you can say hello, share where you are, share if there was something that really resonated. We'll be in there for about 8 minutes, so not too long, and then we'll come back and just do a quick wrap up. But again, thank you all so much, and I'm going to set these breakout rooms for